Earth is still moving at orbital speed. There is no orbit left to sustain that motion. Velocity remains unchanged across the planet's surface, but curvature no longer matches any central force, and the path that should close never bends back. The ground does not fall away beneath objects, yet the reference frame that defined weight has already fractured into incompatible directions. Oceans hold their shape for a moment, but the gradients that stabilize them have been erased, leaving pressure without alignment. Gravity has not disappeared. It has lost coordination. The first seconds do not produce chaos. They produce disagreement between systems that were never designed to operate independently, and that disagreement cannot be reversed. Velocity continues without interruption, but there is no longer a path for it to follow. The motion is intact. The geometry that made it meaningful is gone. Gravity is still acting on every mass, but those forces no longer agree on a single direction. Each point is pulled, but not toward the same center. Alignment has collapsed. The system is not breaking apart. It is losing agreement faster than it can hold shape. The first measurable condition appears in acceleration readings across the surface. Every instrument records force, but vectors diverge by location, and divergence increases over distance instead of stabilizing toward a shared center. A model forms that Earth has entered free translation, carrying its existing velocity through space, while internal gravity remains locally intact. That reading holds for a moment because nothing immediately fractures. Then, the pressure gradients in the oceans fail to align with that model. Water does not redistribute toward a new equilibrium surface. It begins to form uneven bulges that do not correspond to rotation or tidal forcing. The expectation is a gradual shift. Instead, local surfaces rise and fall without a consistent axis, indicating that gravitational reference is no longer global. The earlier reading weakens because internal gravity should still enforce a coherent equipotential surface. The ground does not move, but weight begins to vary across short distances. Adjacent structures register different effective loads without any change in mass. A stable interpretation tries to hold that these are transient imbalances caused by the loss of solar anchoring. That fails when identical materials at similar elevations report incompatible forces. The variation is not environmental. It is structural to the field itself. The system is still pulling. It no longer agrees on where down is. Atmospheric behavior adds a second layer of conflict. Air does not disperse uniformly outward, which would be expected if Earth had simply lost its central binding. Instead, pockets of compression form at mid-altitudes while surface pressure drops irregularly. This creates vertical currents that do not correspond to thermal gradients or rotation. The earlier assumption of intact internal gravity collapses further because the atmosphere responds to a field that is no longer radially consistent. At a simpler level, standing on the surface would still feel like weight, but that weight would not match the direction of the ground beneath it. The mismatch is small at first. It is enough to destabilize orientation without removing contact. A new reading attempts to stabilize. Earth retains mass. Gravity persists. The failure lies in coordination across scale, not in magnitude. Each region behaves as if it has its own local center, slightly offset from every other. This model explains the conflicting pressure, the uneven weight, and the absence of immediate disintegration. Then orbital velocity interferes with that model. The planet continues moving at the same speed it had while bound to the Sun. But that velocity now has no curvature to follow. In a coordinated system, internal gravity would remain symmetric relative to the planet's center of mass. Instead, forward motion begins to bias the distribution of effective forces. The leading edge of Earth experiences a subtle reduction in downward pull, while the trailing edge compresses. This should produce a global gradient. It does not resolve into one. Different regions exhibit opposing gradients simultaneously, as if the velocity vector is interacting with multiple conflicting centers of mass. The model of local centers begins to fracture because those centers cannot remain fixed if they respond differently to the same motion. An earlier assumption breaks. There is no single center of mass governing the field anymore. Seismic data provides a third contradiction. Deep interior measurements show stress redistribution without corresponding surface deformation. Forces are being applied internally in directions that do not propagate outward in a consistent pattern. This suggests that the breakdown is not confined to surface or atmosphere, but extends through the entire mass of the planet. The structure remains intact, but the forces inside it no longer resolve into a single equilibrium. The simplest statement becomes unavoidable. Earth is still held together, but not by one coherent gravitational system. The initial reading of free translation with intact internal gravity is no longer viable. A new model forms by forcing consistency where none was observed before. Earth is treated as a distributed gravitational system where each volume element retains its own attraction and the total field emerges from their sum. This removes the need for a single dominant center and allows for local variation without immediate structural failure. The earlier contradictions begin to compress into a single framework. In this model, gravity has not lost strength, it has lost coherence across distance. Each region continues to attract mass, but the superposition of those attractions no longer resolves cleanly into one direction at larger scales. Small regions behave normally. Larger regions begin to interfere with each other. The mismatch grows with separation, not with intensity. That explains the uneven weight readings. It explains the ocean surfaces failing to settle into a single level. It explains why the atmosphere forms pockets of compression rather than a uniform gradient. Each layer is responding to a field that only agrees locally. At a simpler level, nearby matter still pulls together correctly. Farther apart matter begins to disagree on where together is. The planet remains intact because short-range interactions dominate over long-range coordination. The crust holds. The mantle does not immediately separate. The core remains enclosed. Structural integrity survives because cohesion operates over smaller distances than orbital mechanics ever required. This model stabilizes the earlier evidence. It predicts that misalignment will be subtle at first, then grow as interactions accumulate across scale. It predicts that no single catastrophic rupture occurs immediately. Instead, multiple small inconsistencies compound. Then, a minor inconsistency appears inside the model itself. Orbital velocity is still uniform across the planet, but if gravity is now locally defined, that velocity should produce consistent forward bias in all regions. It should not fragment into conflicting gradients. Yet the earlier observations showed simultaneous compression and reduction in different areas. The model holds, but not cleanly. To preserve it, the velocity must interact differently with each local gravitational cluster. That requires those clusters to behave as semi-independent systems rather than components of a unified whole. Each region effectively carries its own inertial frame. This is the first point where the model becomes uncomfortable. Because if regions carry independent frames, then the planet is no longer a single dynamical object. It is a collection of partially coupled systems moving together only by proximity. The planet has not lost gravity, it has lost singularity. That statement resolves multiple contradictions at once. Oceans fail because their mass spans many regions with slightly different centers. Atmosphere destabilizes because pressure fields cross boundaries between inconsistent frames. Weight varies because the ground beneath is not aligned with a global reference. For a moment, the system appears explainable again. Short-range cohesion holds matter together. Long-range coordination fails. Velocity interacts unevenly with fragmented frames. The planet persists as a clustered structure rather than a unified one. But one detail remains exposed and unresolved. If each region carries its own frame, then there is no mechanism left to keep those frames synchronized over time. Those local frames do not remain aligned even for a second. They begin separating immediately. The assumption that proximity alone can maintain cohesion fails at the moment velocity continues without shared curvature. Each region advances along its own inertial path, and those paths are not parallel once their gravitational references diverge. The earlier model required slow drift. The evidence shows angular deviation. The fragments are not drifting apart. They are rotating away from each other. This breaks the core stability of the distributed system. If regions rotate relative to each other, then local gravity cannot remain internally consistent either. What was assumed to be short-range stability begins to fracture under its own motion. Forces that once held matter together now compete across shifting directions. The collapse has already started. Internal stresses amplify instead of dissipating. The mantle experiences shear forces that do not propagate cleanly because adjacent volumes are no longer aligned. This creates zones where compression and tension exist simultaneously, not sequentially. A stable material cannot resolve both at once. The earlier explanation of intact cohesion is no longer valid. The ocean behavior becomes decisive. Water does not just form uneven surfaces, it begins to separate into moving masses that follow different accelerations. These masses do not recombine because their paths no longer intersect. A liquid cannot maintain continuity if its internal particles disagree on direction. Atmospheric pockets intensify into streams that cross each other without merging. Airflows intersect and pass through conflicting gradients, creating regions where pressure cannot equalize. The model predicted instability. It did not predict non-resolution. At a simpler level, nearby matter no longer agrees on where to move next. The concept of local gravitational centers fails because those centers cannot remain fixed while their reference frames rotate. Each region is effectively dragging its own definition of down through space, and those definitions collide. One contradiction becomes unavoidable. If gravity remains, but its reference frame rotates independently in each region, then gravitational force is no longer conservative across the system. Energy does not redistribute predictably. It accumulates in mismatched directions. That cannot stabilize. Seismic data now shows propagation delays that should not exist. Waves do not travel uniformly through the interior because the medium itself is no longer consistent. Paths bend unpredictably, not due to density changes, but due to shifting force alignment within the material. The planet is no longer a single medium. It is a set of incompatible trajectories forced into contact. The earlier model assumed fragmentation would be gradual. It is already structural. A short realization follows from all domains. There is no shared frame left anywhere in the system. Without a shared frame, gravity cannot define a stable shape. Without a stable shape, cohesion cannot persist beyond immediate contact. And without cohesion, the distinction between regions becomes physical, not conceptual. The planet is no longer dividing. It has already lost the condition required to remain one object. The failure is not gravitational fragmentation. It is frame collapse. All prior interpretations treated gravity as the variable that degraded, but the evidence shows gravity continuing in every region with measurable strength. What fails is the agreement between those regions about direction, and that agreement was never enforced by gravity alone. It was enforced by a shared orbital frame tied to a central mass. That frame is gone, and nothing replaces it. The system does not break because forces weaken. It breaks because those forces no longer reference the same geometry. Gravity remains fully active inside each region, but without a common frame, those forces cannot produce a coherent structure. They act correctly in isolation and incorrectly in aggregate. This reclassification removes the need for multiple local centers behaving independently. There are no stable centers anymore, local or global. There are only transient alignments that shift as each region carries its own inertial direction forward. At a simpler level, everything is still being pulled, but nothing agrees on where that pull points over time. This explains why earlier observations seemed contradictory. Oceans did not fail because gravity weakened, but because the surface that defined level no longer existed as a shared reference. Atmosphere did not destabilize due to pressure imbalance alone, but because pressure could not resolve across regions moving under different directional assumptions. Weight varied because the ground itself no longer represented a consistent downward vector. The previous model of distributed gravity is insufficient because distribution still requires coordination. The decisive shift is this: the planet is no longer a gravitationally bound object in a shared frame. It is a collection of masses, each obeying gravity correctly within incompatible frames. That condition cannot stabilize, not even temporarily. Once frames diverge, every interaction between regions becomes a misalignment problem. Contact forces, pressure forces, and internal stresses all attempt to resolve differences that continuously change. Resolution cannot complete before the reference itself shifts again. Equilibrium becomes impossible. A pressure spike appears in the simplest interaction. Two adjacent regions attempt to exchange force. Each computes direction differently. The result is not balance. It is oscillation that amplifies instead of dampening. The system begins to generate its own instability. At this point, fragmentation is no longer a process that will occur. It is the only state that remains available. The object persists only where forces accidentally align for a moment, and those alignments decay immediately. The earlier assumption that cohesion could hold locally is removed. There is no local anymore. The sequence begins before separation is visible. The orbital path fails first, but velocity remains unchanged. Earth continues forward, carrying a motion that was designed to curve, now forced into a straight trajectory without a center to reference. The initial condition is not loss of speed, it is loss of curvature. Gravity continues acting everywhere. It simply stops agreeing across distance. At the same moment, the shared orbital frame collapses. Every region retains inertia, but no region shares the same directional definition of down over time. The first divergence is microscopic. It exists as angular difference, not displacement. Then it accumulates. Adjacent regions begin to interpret acceleration differently. The difference is small enough to avoid immediate rupture, but large enough to prevent alignment. Internal forces attempt to correct it. They fail because the reference they depend on is no longer fixed. The correction never lands. Oceans respond next because they require continuous agreement across large surfaces. Water begins to separate in the flows that no longer recombine. Each mass follows its own resolved direction of gravity, and those directions drift apart faster than fluid continuity can maintain contact. Continuity breaks early. Atmosphere follows the same pattern, but faster. Air parcels accelerate along diverging paths, intersect, and fail to merge into stable pressure gradients. Compression zones form, dissolve, and reform elsewhere without stabilizing. The system loses the ability to equalize. Then the interior responds. The mantle and core experience force misalignment under constant motion. Stress does not distribute evenly. It concentrates in shifting zones where incompatible frames overlap. These zones move, preventing any single failure from releasing accumulated energy. Stress becomes persistent. At a simpler level, the planet tries to hold itself together, but every part is pulling in a slightly different direction that keeps changing. The final acceleration of failure occurs when rotational motion interacts with frame divergence. Spin introduces additional directional dependence, amplifying misalignment across the surface. Regions at different latitudes no longer share compatible inertial paths. Rotation stops being stabilizing. It becomes a multiplier. Fragments begin to form not from explosive force, but from the inability to maintain contact across misaligned trajectories. Material separates along boundaries where alignment fails fastest. These boundaries are not fixed, they propagate. Separation accelerates. The last stage is not a break, it is a loss of shared motion. Each fragment continues forward with inherited velocity, but now fully independent, carrying its own local gravitational field that no longer conflicts because it no longer interacts at scale. The transition completes in motion, not in impact. The mismatch stops being distributed. It becomes directional. Then it becomes separation. Once separation begins, alternatives disappear quickly. Each fragment carries forward its velocity, but without any mechanism to re-establish a shared frame, their paths diverge permanently. There is no corrective force left that operates across fragments. Interaction stops scaling. Gravity continues inside each fragment, but between fragments, it becomes negligible relative to their diverging trajectories. Distance increases not because of acceleration alone, but because direction itself is no longer aligned. Even small angular differences expand into irreversible separation. They do not drift back. Fragments retain internal structure only where their own local frame remains coherent. Within those boundaries, gravity stabilizes matter again. Outside those boundaries, no interaction persists long enough to matter. The system resolves into isolated domains. At a simpler level, each piece becomes its own small world, and none of them share a common direction anymore. Residual stresses inside fragments decay unevenly. Some regions stabilize quickly. Others continue to deform until their internal frames settle. The earlier oscillations disappear, not because equilibrium is restored globally, but because each fragment no longer competes with others. Conflict ends through isolation. One constraint becomes absolute. Without a shared orbital frame, no large-scale structure can reform. Even if fragments pass near each other, their gravitational interaction cannot recreate the original condition, because alignment in velocity and frame would need to match exactly. That requirement is no longer accessible. Reassembly is removed. The remaining motion is simple and final. Each fragment follows its own inertial path, shaped only by its internal gravity and any incidental encounters that cannot scale into reconstruction. The original system does not exist in any recoverable form. The condition locks. There is no path back to a single object, not through collision, not through attraction, not through time. The planet did not fail by breaking apart. It failed by losing the condition required to remain one system. Gravity never stopped acting. Velocity never stopped carrying mass forward. What disappeared was the shared frame that allowed those forces to agree on a single structure. Once that frame collapsed, every remaining interaction became incompatible by definition. The object could no longer exist as an object. Each fragment continues under the same laws, but no longer under the same reality. Internal gravity stabilizes them individually, but no interaction between them can recreate a unified state. The requirement for unity is not force, it is agreement. That agreement is gone. The final classification is not destruction in the conventional sense. It is the removal of coherence across scale, where motion persists, forces persist, but system identity does not.